Take a moment. Look around you, the phone in your hand, the screen you're watching this on, the battery inside it, the charger, the clothes you're wearing, the lights above you. None of these things feel political. They don't feel ideological. They don't feel controversial. They feel normal. And that's exactly the point, because hidden inside this normality is a country that most people in the West only think about in extremes. A country that shows up constantly in the news. A country often described with words like authoritarian, repressive, controlled. And yet, quietly, it has become inseparable from everyday American life. That country is China. Not as a distant place on a map, not as an abstract geopolitical concept, but as an invisible presence woven into almost everything we touch. Your phone didn't just appear. Its components traveled through supply chains that stretch across continents. Your clothes didn't materialize on store shelves. They passed through factories, ports, ships, warehouses, even the technologies now shaping the future. Artificial intelligence, batteries, renewable energy are deeply connected to one place more than any other, China. And here's where the discomfort begins, because China is also widely criticized for its human rights record, for its political system, for the degree of control the state holds over information, speech, and individual life. Those two realities exist at the same time, and they don't fit together easily. On one hand, China is known in the West as a country where political freedom is limited. On the other hand, it has lifted more people out of poverty than any country in human history, more than 800 million people. That number is so large, it almost loses meaning. It represents entire populations, families, villages, cities, moving from subsistence survival into modern economic life within a single generation. In 1960, the average Chinese citizen lived on the equivalent of less than $100 a year. Today, that number is measured in the thousands. Life expectancy has nearly doubled. Infrastructure appeared where none existed. Cities rose where farmland once stood. This did not happen slowly, and it did not happen quietly. And yet, this transformation didn't follow the path that Western political theory says it should. China did not become a liberal democracy. It did not adopt Western political institutions. It did not hold nationwide competitive elections as a prerequisite for growth. And according to decades of assumptions in economics and political science, that shouldn't work. The dominant belief, especially after the Cold War, was that economic development and political liberalization go hand in hand. Get richer and you become freer. Build markets and democracy follows. But China broke that expectation. It opened its economy without opening its political system. It allowed markets to grow under tight state supervision. It encouraged wealth creation without surrendering centralized control. And instead of collapsing, the system expanded. Instead of stagnating, it accelerated. Instead of liberalizing politically, it stabilized. For many observers in the West, this outcome wasn't just surprising, it was unsettling, because it challenged something deeper than a single country's trajectory. It challenged the assumption that there is only one path to modernity. And that brings us to the paradox at the center of this story. China is often described as a country that limits individual freedoms. Yet it delivered one of the greatest improvements in material living standards the world has ever seen. China is criticized for control, yet it produced decades of economic stability. While many democracies struggled with cycles of crisis, polarization, and stagnation, China is portrayed as rigid. yet it adapted its economic model faster than many open societies. These statements are not excuses. They are not endorsements. They are facts that exist together, whether we are comfortable with them or not. And ignoring one side does not make the other disappear. For a long time, the prevailing assumption in the West was that China's system was temporary, that rapid growth would eventually slow, that rising incomes would lead to political pressure, that the system would either reform itself or collapse under its own contradictions. That belief shaped policy decisions, corporate strategies, and even academic research, but decades passed. And China didn't collapse. It didn't democratize either. Instead, it became the world's manufacturing backbone, then a technological contender, then an economic force, large enough to reshape global markets. Today, it is no longer possible to imagine the global economy without it. And that forces a difficult question, especially for Western audiences. If a system that wasn't supposed to work did work, what does that say about the assumptions we started with? This documentary is not here to praise China. It is not here to condemn it, and it is not here to predict winners or losers. Its purpose is simpler and harder to understand. To understand how this system emerged, why it succeeded where it did, where it failed, and what trade-offs made that success possible. Because whether we like it or not, the Chinese model exists, and it has already reshaped the world we live in. The phone in your pocket, the supply chains behind your economy, the prices you pay, the technologies you use. These are not distant abstractions. They are the downstream effects of decisions made decades ago inside a system most outsiders never fully expected to survive. So the real question isn't whether China is good or bad. That's too simple. The real question is this: how did a system that wasn't supposed to work actually work? And just as importantly, what did it cost? Before China became a symbol of rapid growth, before it became a manufacturing powerhouse, before it reshaped global supply chains, China failed. Not quietly, not briefly, but repeatedly and at enormous human cost. This part of the story is often skipped, not because it isn't important, but because it's uncomfortable, because the idea that China's success was inevitable makes the present easier to explain. But inevitability is a myth. Before the so-called miracle, China was not rising. It was collapsing. To understand why China's transformation mattered, we first have to understand just how broken the country was. In the first half of the 20th century, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. Decades of internal fragmentation, foreign intervention, and war had left the economy hollowed out. The central government was weak, infrastructure was minimal. Most people lived in rural poverty. But the most destructive force wasn't just poverty, it was instability. By the late 1930s and 1940s, China was experiencing one of the worst inflation crises in modern history. The government printed money to survive war, then printed more to cover its debts, then printed even more as confidence evaporated. Prices didn't rise gradually. They exploded. Savings became worthless almost overnight. Wages lagged behind prices by weeks, then days, then hours. Money stopped functioning as money for ordinary people. This wasn't an economic theory. It was daily chaos. Farmers couldn't plan. Workers couldn't budget. Merchants couldn't price goods. Trust, the invisible foundation of any economy, collapsed. Corruption flourished in the vacuum. Officials hoarded resources. Connections mattered more than productivity. The gap between elites and ordinary people widened. By the late 1940s, many Chinese citizens no longer believed the existing system could deliver stability, let alone prosperity. That loss of faith mattered. Because when institutions fail, people don't ask for perfection. They ask for order, and order arrived in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party took power. For the first time in generations, China was unified under a single authority. The new government promised discipline, equality, and national revival. For a population exhausted by chaos, that promise carried enormous weight. But unity alone does not create prosperity. And ideology does not replace economics. The early years of the new regime focused on consolidating power and reshaping society. Land was redistributed. Private ownership was dismantled. The state took control of production. At first, some measures seemed to bring stability. Inflation was brought under control. Basic order was restored. The government could finally enforce policy nationwide. But beneath the surface, a more dangerous experiment was beginning. An experiment driven not by data, not by incentives, but by belief. That experiment reached its peak in the late 1950s, with a campaign known as the Great Leap Forward. Its goal was radical transformation, to turn an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Almost overnight, villages were reorganized into massive communes. Private farming was eliminated. Production targets were set, not by reality, but by ideology. Steel furnaces were built in backyards. Tools were melted down to meet quotas. Agriculture was deprioritized in favor of symbolic industrial output. Local officials, afraid to report failure, inflated production numbers. The system rewarded optimism, not accuracy. And when false data moved upward, policy moved in the wrong direction. Food was requisitioned based on fictional surpluses. Grain reserves vanished. Harvests failed. What followed was one of the worst famines in human history. Tens of millions of people died. Not because of drought alone, not because of war, but because an economic system refused to correct itself. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning. When ideology overrides feedback, mistakes compound. When dissent is silenced, errors become invisible. And when power is centralized without restraint, failure spreads faster than reform. But the lesson was not learned immediately. In the mid-1960s, another campaign reshaped the country. This time, the target wasn't production, it was thought. The Cultural Revolution sought to eliminate incorrect ideas, institutions, and people. Schools were closed. Intellectuals were denounced. Experience was treated as suspicion. Young people were mobilized against teachers, experts, and administrators. Economic activity didn't just slow. In many areas, it stopped. Factories lost skilled managers. Universities ceased functioning. Research collapsed. Fear replaced coordination. For nearly a decade, China's economy stagnated or regressed. By the mid-1970s, the country was unified, but exhausted. It had order, but little efficiency. It had control, but almost no flexibility. And most importantly, it had no clear path forward. When leadership changed in the late 1970s, the new reality became impossible to ignore. China was not competing with advanced economies. It was struggling to feed itself. Living standards lagged far behind. Not just the West, but many developing countries. Industrial output was inefficient. Technology was outdated. Incentives were misaligned. The revolutionary promise had delivered stability, but at a staggering economic cost. This is the moment most miracle narratives leave out because it complicates the story. China's later success did not emerge from a position of strength. It emerged from failure, deep failure. The kind of failure that forces rethinking, not because of theory, but because survival demands it. There was no triumphal confidence at the end of this period. There was urgency and fear that without change, the system would stagnate indefinitely or collapse entirely. This context matters because the reforms that followed were not born from ideological enthusiasm. They were born from desperation. They were not a grand vision of future dominance. They were an attempt to prevent national ruin. China did not rise because its early system worked. It rose because its early system failed. And the cost of that failure was impossible to deny. That is the foundation on which everything else was built. Not inevitability, not destiny, but collapse. And standing at the edge of that collapse, China faced a choice: cling to doctrine or adapt. And what happened next would change the trajectory of the country and eventually the world. This wasn't a miracle in the making. This was a country at the edge of collapse. By the late 1970s, China was not dreaming about global leadership. It was trying to survive. The country was unified, but exhausted. The economy was stagnant. Technology lagged decades behind. Living standards remained painfully low. Factories existed, but they were inefficient. Farms existed, but they barely produced enough food. Schools existed, but a generation of expertise had been lost. The revolutionary promise had delivered control, but not prosperity. And for the first time since 1949, the leadership could no longer explain away the gap between ideology and reality. This is where the story usually becomes simplified. It's often told as a sudden awakening, a moment of clarity, a clean break from the past. But that's not what happened. What happened was far more cautious, more pragmatic, and far more dangerous politically, because the reforms that followed did not come from confidence. They came from fear. Fear that without change, China would remain permanently poor. Fear that the system would lose legitimacy, not because of foreign pressure, but because it could not deliver a better life. In 1978, China stood at a crossroads, and the most important decision was not about ideology, it was about rules. For decades, the rules had been clear. The state controlled production. Markets were distrusted. Private profit was viewed with suspicion. Those rules had shaped everything, and now they were failing. Breaking them was not a philosophical shift. It was a survival strategy. The question was not whether markets were morally acceptable. The question was whether China could afford to ignore them any longer. The leadership chose an unusual path. They did not abandon socialism. They did not embrace Western liberalism. They did something far more uncomfortable. They experimented quietly, selectively, and without admitting, at first, how radical the change actually was. The first rule China broke was the idea that markets and socialism were mutually exclusive. Instead of debating theory, the leadership focused on outcomes. If a policy increased production, it stayed. If it failed, it was discarded. Not because it was ideologically wrong, but because it didn't work. This mindset marked a profound shift. For the first time, economic performance, not political purity, became the primary test of policy. The second rule China broke was uniformity. Previously, Policies were applied nationwide. Success or failure was shared across the entire country. Reform changed that. Instead of transforming everything at once, China allowed specific regions to operate under different rules. These areas became laboratories. If they failed, the damage would be contained. If they succeeded, the model could expand. This was the logic behind special economic zones, designated spaces, where market forces were permitted to operate under controlled conditions. Foreign investment was welcomed. Private enterprise was tolerated. Exports were encouraged. These zones were not democracies. They were tightly managed environments, but within them, prices mattered. Incentives mattered. Efficiency mattered. And the results were immediate. Factories in these zones produced more faster. Workers earned higher incomes. Local governments collected more revenue. Success created momentum. And momentum created political cover, because results are difficult to argue with. The third rule China broke was isolation. For decades, the country had viewed foreign capital as a threat. Now, it became a tool. Western companies were invited in, not to shape policy, but to supply capital, technology, and access to global markets. This was not charity. China offered something in return: labor, scale, and a willingness to build. What emerged was not blind openness. It was controlled exposure. Foreign firms operated under restrictions. Knowledge transfer was encouraged. Domestic capacity was prioritized. China was not outsourcing its future. It was studying it. Exports became the engine. Not because exports were ideologically favored, but because they forced discipline. Global markets do not reward slogans. They reward efficiency, reliability, and cost control. By competing abroad, Chinese firms learned what worked and what didn't. Failure carried consequences. Success brought expansion. Over time, this pressure reshaped entire industries. The most important rule China did not break was political control. Markets expanded, but the political system did not open. There were no competitive national elections, no independent judiciary, no free press in the Western sense. This was not an oversight, it was intentional. The leadership believed that political liberalization would introduce instability before economic development was complete. In other words, China separated economic reform from political reform. This decision is central to understanding everything that followed. Markets were tools, not ends. Growth was a priority, not individual autonomy. Stability remained non-negotiable. This combination defied Western expectations. According to prevailing theory, markets eventually demand political freedom. China challenged that assumption, not by disproving it outright, but by delaying it. And in that delay, something remarkable happened. Growth compounded, incomes rose, urbanization accelerated. Infrastructure expanded at an unprecedented pace. Hundreds of millions moved from subsistence agriculture into wage labor. Cities grew faster than anyone predicted. This was not a smooth transition. Mistakes were constant. Inequality widened. Environmental damage increased. Corruption adapted to new opportunities. But compared to the stagnation before, the difference was undeniable. China did not become wealthy overnight, but it began moving, quickly and decisively, in a direction it had never moved before. From the outside, this looked like imitation, factories, exports, foreign investment. It looked like China copying the West. But that interpretation misses the point. China did not copy Western institutions. It did not import Western political values. It borrowed mechanisms and embedded them inside a system that remained fundamentally different. Markets operated, but within boundaries. Private enterprise existed, but under supervision. Foreign capital flowed, but on Chinese terms. This selective absorption is what made the model resilient. It avoided ideological purity, but it also avoided ideological surrender. For American audiences, this is the moment that matters most, because it reveals a truth that is uncomfortable for both sides. China's success was not accidental, but it was not inevitable either. It was the result of deliberate trade-offs. Trade-offs that prioritized growth over openness, stability over pluralism, control over unpredictability. Whether those trade-offs were justified is a moral question, but whether they worked for a time is an empirical one, and they worked. Not because China embraced Western ideals, but because it was willing to break its own rules, quietly, incrementally, and without announcing a revolution. This was not a rejection of the past. It was a strategic retreat from it, a retreat designed to preserve power by delivering results. And for decades, those results spoke loudly. China didn't copy the West. It selectively absorbed it. And in doing so, it set itself on a path that would reshape the global economy and force the world to rethink assumptions that once seemed unshakable. But this turn, as transformative as it was, came with consequences that would only become visible much later, because every system that bends its own rules creates new tensions, and every compromise carries a price. Those tensions and that price would define the next phase of China's rise. Up to this point, China's story can still sound familiar. A poor country reforms, it opens to trade, it grows. Many nations have done that. What happens next is where China stops being comparable, because from this moment on, China's advantage is no longer ideology, it's scale, and scale changes everything. When people talk about China's population, 1.4 billion people, it's usually framed as a burden, more mouths to feed, more jobs to create, more pressure on resources. But at a certain point, scale stops being a problem, it becomes a system. A system so large that the rules begin to change. For most countries, the domestic market is a constraint. It limits how fast companies can grow, how much they can test, how much failure they can absorb. In China, the domestic market is the experiment. A single province can have a population larger than most countries. A single city can function like an entire economy. That means ideas don't need to succeed globally to succeed meaningfully. They only need to work locally, at first. If a business model fails in one city, it can be abandoned quietly. If it works, it can be copied rapidly across dozens of cities, hundreds of millions of people. This is not how innovation works in smaller systems. In the United States, a product often needs national success to survive. In China, regional success can be enough to justify massive expansion. Scale lowers the cost of experimentation, and that changes risk behavior. Chinese firms can try things that would be economically irrational elsewhere, because even a small success rate multiplied by a massive population produces results. Scale also changes data. In most countries, data is scarce, fragmented, and slow. In China, data accumulates by default. Daily transactions, transportation, payments, communication. Hundreds of millions of users generate feedback continuously, not in controlled trials, but in real life. This feedback loop is powerful. It allows systems to be optimized quickly. Mistakes are identified faster, trends emerge sooner. And because platforms are integrated, payments, messaging, services, data is not siloed in the same way. This doesn't automatically create better ideas, but it dramatically accelerates the refinement of ideas. Which brings us to a critical distinction between China and the United States. The United States excels at invention. Breakthroughs often originate in American universities, labs, and startups. New paradigms, new technologies, new concepts. China excels at deployment, taking an idea and implementing it at massive scale, turning prototypes into infrastructure, turning services into habits. This is not a moral difference. It's a structural one. In the US, systems are fragmented. Regulation varies by state. Infrastructure is decentralized. Institutions move cautiously. This protects individual rights, but it slows coordination. In China, once a direction is chosen, alignment is faster. Standards are unified. Infrastructure is coordinated. Adoption can be rapid. That's why technologies often spread differently. A payment app in China doesn't compete for years against dozens of incompatible systems. It becomes dominant quickly. Not because users were forced, but because network effects activate faster at scale. Once adoption passes a threshold, alternatives become irrelevant. One app becomes hundreds of millions of users, not through global expansion, through domestic saturation. This is where copying China fails. Other countries see the outcome, a super app, a massive platform, a unified ecosystem, and try to replicate it, but without scale. The same strategies don't work. A smaller market cannot absorb failure. At the same rate, a fragmented society cannot coordinate adoption as efficiently. Scale also transforms manufacturing. In many countries, manufacturing is one sector among many. In China, it became the backbone. Entire regions specialized. Supply chains clustered tightly, suppliers, assemblers, logistics, often within hours of each other. This proximity reduced costs, compressed timelines, and enabled iteration. If a component failed, it could be redesigned, produced, and tested almost immediately. That speed compounds. It allows products to evolve faster than competitors. Operating across borders, scale also influences labor. China's workforce migration from rural areas to cities was not incremental, it was massive. Tens of millions of people moved within a generation. This created flexibility that most economies never experience. When demand shifted, labor followed. When industries rose, workers adapted. This mobility wasn't painless. It involved social disruption, inequality, and pressure on urban systems, but it allowed the economy to reallocate resources quickly. Another advantage of scale is resilience. When one sector slows, another can absorb the shock. When external demand weakens, internal demand can partially compensate. The domestic market becomes a buffer against global volatility. This doesn't make China immune to crises, but it changes their shape. It also changes strategic thinking. Chinese companies don't need to win everywhere. They need to dominate at home. Once that happens, global expansion becomes optional. This is fundamentally different from export-dependent economies that rely on external markets for survival. and it explains something that often confuses Western observers: why Chinese platforms don't always prioritize global acceptance, why some services remain domestic, why compatibility with Western norms is sometimes secondary. They are not competing inside the same system. They are operating inside their own. This system has its own logic, its own scale, its own feedback loops, and once it reaches a certain size, it becomes self-reinforcing. Success generates data. Data improves services. Improved services increase adoption. Adoption strengthens dominance. Breaking into such a system from the outside becomes extremely difficult. This is not because of hostility. It's because of gravity. Large systems pull inward. This is also why comparisons with the US often miss the point. The United States does not need to operate this way. Its strength lies elsewhere, in creativity, in flexibility, in individual initiative. China's strength lies in coordination, in scaling, in turning direction into momentum. Neither model is universally superior. Each has trade-offs, but they are not playing the same game. And that's the mistake many analysts make. They assume competition occurs within a single framework, that China and the US are racing on the same track. They are not. They are building different tracks with different rules. China is not competing. Inside the global system, it built its own. And once that system reached sufficient scale, it became difficult to replicate, difficult to penetrate, and difficult to ignore. Understanding this is essential, because without it, China's behavior looks irrational. With it, China's choices, from technology to trade to regulation, become more predictable, not admirable, not condemnable, predictable. But scale, for all its advantages, creates its own pressures. Coordination can turn into rigidity. Dominance can stifle creativity. Integration can magnify systemic risk. And as systems grow larger, their failures become harder to contain, which brings us to the next phase of the story. Because the same forces that gave China its unfair advantage also created the conditions for its most serious challenges. Up to this point, China's story can feel impressive. A country that failed, then adapted, then scaled. Hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty. Infrastructure built at unprecedented speed. Industries deployed with ruthless efficiency. But no system expands without consequence. Every system that prioritizes control eventually encounters its limits, not in a single moment, not as a collapse, but as pressure. And pressure reveals where flexibility ends. China's model was built to solve one overriding problem: instability, the trauma of famine, the chaos of inflation, the fear of fragmentation. Control was not abstract ideology. It was a response to history, and for decades, that control delivered results. But the same mechanisms that once created stability now shape a different reality. One that is harder to measure, harder to confront, and harder to reverse. The first signs appear in places that once symbolized success. Take real estate. For years, property development became one of China's most reliable engines of growth. Cities expanded outward and upward. Apartments represented security, wealth, and a tangible reward for decades of hard work. For local governments, land sales became a primary source of revenue. For households, property became the safest place to store savings. The system reinforced itself. More development increased prices. Rising prices encouraged more development. But this was not organic demand alone. It was guided. Credit flowed where growth targets required it. Construction continued because it supported employment, local budgets, and the appearance of momentum. Over time, the line between demand and expectation blurred. Homes were purchased, not to live in, but to hold. Entire districts were built before populations arrived. This did not immediately look like failure. It looked like confidence, but systems built on expectation require constant reassurance, and reassurance becomes harder. When growth slows, the issue was not that real estate existed. The issue was concentration. Too much capital, too much faith, too many incentives pointing in the same direction. When correction began, it did not need to be dramatic to be destabilizing. Because real estate in China is not just an asset class. It is a store of trust, and when trust wavers, the effects ripple quietly through households, local governments, and financial institutions. At the same time, another pressure was building, one that infrastructure cannot solve. Demographics. China is aging. Not gradually but rapidly. Decades of declining birth rates have created a population structure that looks very different from the one that powered its rise. The workforce is shrinking. The number of retirees is growing. This shift matters because China's model relied heavily on labor availability, mobility, and adaptability. A younger population can absorb disruption. It can migrate. It can retrain. An older population is less flexible. Healthcare costs rise. Pension obligations increase. Risk tolerance declines. Growth slows not because effort disappears, but because the structure supporting it changes. This demographic reality is not unique to China. Many developed countries face similar trends. What makes China's case distinct is timing. China is aging before it becomes fully wealthy, which compresses the margin for error. This pressure is felt most visibly among younger generations. For decades, each generation in China expected a better life than the one before it. That expectation was fulfilled repeatedly. Rural to urban, factory to office, manual labor to digital services. But expectations are harder to sustain once growth normalizes. Youth unemployment became a sensitive indicator, not because young people stopped working, but because the types of jobs that once absorbed them were no longer expanding at the same pace. High-skill positions require time. Low-skill positions require demand. When both narrow simultaneously, friction appears, and friction is dangerous in systems that emphasize stability. Young people are not a political threat by default, but disengagement is. A generation that delays milestones, careers, family formation, ownership, alters the social contract, not through protest, but through withdrawal. Another quiet shift is happening in the behavior of entrepreneurs. For years, China encouraged private initiative. As long as it aligned with national priorities, risk was tolerated because growth was essential. But as systems mature, the cost of misalignment increases, regulation tightens, boundaries become less ambiguous. This does not eliminate entrepreneurship, but it reshapes it. Risk-taking declines. Long-term bets feel less attractive. Capital becomes cautious. Innovation still happens, but it favors incremental improvement over disruptive change. This is not suppression. It is adaptation to signals, and signals matter. Which brings us to the most fragile element of any economic system: confidence. Confidence is not optimism, it is predictability. The belief that rules will remain legible, that success will be rewarded consistently, that failure will be survivable. When confidence weakens, behavior changes subtly. People save more, spend less, delay decisions. These are not acts of resistance. They are acts of caution, and caution, when widespread, slows momentum. This is why it's important not to frame China's current challenges as crisis. Crisis implies rupture. What China is experiencing is compression, multiple pressures converging within a tightly coordinated system. Real estate absorbing too much trust, demographics reducing flexibility, youth uncertainty altering expectations, entrepreneurial caution slowing dynamism. None of these alone would define the system. Together, they test it. And here's the paradox: the very control that allowed China to move quickly, align resources, and suppress volatility also makes adjustment more complex. In decentralized systems, failure is distributed. In centralized systems, failure concentrates. That does not make one superior, it makes them different. China's system is not brittle, but it is less forgiving. Small miscalculations take longer to correct. Feedback travels upward carefully. Policy reversals are measured. This preserves stability, but at the cost of speed. The challenge now is not whether China can grow, it can. The challenge is whether it can adapt with the same efficiency that once defined its expansion. Control is excellent at building. It is less effective at letting go, and letting go is often required for the next phase of growth. This is not a prediction of decline. It is an observation of trade-offs, trade-offs that were accepted consciously, trade-offs that delivered extraordinary results, and trade-offs that now shape the limits of flexibility. China is not facing the end of its model. It is facing the consequences of having the same control that created stability now limits flexibility, and how China responds to that tension will define what comes next, not just for China, but for a world that has grown deeply connected to the outcome. By this point, it's tempting to ask the obvious question: will China overtake the United States? It's the question that dominates headlines, panel discussions, and political debates. But it's also the wrong question, because it assumes the future will resemble the past. It assumes that history is a race with a single finish line, one winner, one model, one system that replaces the other. That assumption made sense in the 20th century. It makes far less sense now. China's story is often framed as a challenge to American leadership, but framing it that way misses something more important. China is not just competing with the United States, it is responding to a world that is already changing, and that world is putting pressure on every system, not just China's. The United States faces its own contradictions. It remains the global center of innovation. Its universities, companies, and capital markets still generate ideas that shape the planet, but innovation alone does not guarantee cohesion. Political polarization has increased. Institutions move more slowly. Large-scale coordination has become harder. Infrastructure ages. Trust erodes. The American system excels at freedom, but struggles with alignment. That trade-off was manageable when growth was rapid and the global order was uncontested. It is less comfortable in an era defined by complexity, speed, and global shocks. China faces a different set of constraints. Its system prioritizes coordination and control. It can mobilize resources quickly. It can pursue long-term objectives with remarkable discipline, but discipline is not the same as adaptability. Control reduces chaos, but it also filters feedback. Mistakes are corrected carefully, sometimes slowly. Innovation exists, but it operates within boundaries. Both systems function. Both systems strain, and neither has proven that it alone can carry the 21st century. This is why the question of who wins is ultimately unhelpful. The world no longer revolves around a single axis of power. Supply chains span continents. Technology evolves faster than governance. Crises do not respect borders. Pandemics, climate shocks, financial instability, demographic shifts. These pressures do not test ideology. They test resilience. And resilience is not about dominance. It's about durability. Which systems can absorb shock without fracturing? Which societies can adapt without losing legitimacy? Which models can evolve without abandoning their core principles? China's rise forced the world to confront an uncomfortable reality. Economic development does not require political liberalization. In the short term, that assumption, central to Western thinking for decades, is no longer universal, but that does not mean China's model is universally replicable. Its scale is unique. Its history is specific. Its social contract is deeply contextual. What works for China may not work elsewhere, and what works now may not work forever. The same is true for the United States. The American model produced extraordinary wealth, technological leadership, and cultural influence, but it also assumed a level of global stability that no longer exists. It assumed endless growth, cheap energy, and uncontested institutions. Those assumptions are being tested, not by China alone, but by reality. This is the deeper question China forces us to confront. Not will China replace America, but what happens when no system has all the answers? The future may not belong to a single model. It may belong to hybrid systems, adaptations, and imperfect compromises. We may see more coordination without less freedom, or more freedom without less stability, or periods of oscillation between openness and control, experimentation and consolidation. History does not move in straight lines. It responds to pressure. China's trajectory is one response. America's trajectory is another. Neither is complete. Neither is final. And neither exists in isolation. The danger lies not in choosing the wrong model, but in assuming one model is permanent. Because permanence breeds complacency, and complacency is fragile. The world ahead will reward systems that can change without collapsing, that can admit error without losing authority, that can absorb difference without disintegration. Those qualities do not belong exclusively to East or West. They are not guaranteed by ideology. They must be cultivated. China is not the future, but it may be a warning that progress does not follow a single script, that success can emerge from unexpected trade-offs, and that the next chapter of global history will not look like the last one. The future will not announce itself with a clear winner. It will arrive quietly through adjustments, failures, and choices made under pressure. And when it does, the question won't be who came out on top. The question will be who was able to endure change without losing what made them work in the first place. That is the question no one can answer yet. And it is the one that matters most.